Wow, what an act to follow. 4 fantastic talks there. And it was really pleasing to see Tom and Betsy as well, and all the work actually that I think you've done since finishing your Masters, and clearly a lot of passion, a lot of enthusiasm, and an awful lot of data is being presented, and with some really fascinating results. As Tom and Betsy have already suggested, there were 3 other Master's students working with them at the same time on a similar kind of research program that we're trying to get started, and they couldn't be here today. That's Claire Wallace, Claire Murphy, and Georgina Pashler. So I'm going to try and cover those 3 talks plus a couple of other ones in the same amount of time. So shallow and fast. So I'm not going to be doing justice to these students is the point I'm going to be making essentially. So really excited to be here working at Knepp. I think it's just such a fantastic opportunity. One of the things I get really frustrated with sometimes working in academia is we get very, very site orientated of saying we have to compare what's going on between different management styles and management activities. Oh, got a bird in there. Biodiversity's just increased already. We get lots of comparisons between sites needed. What I think is so interesting about Knepp and what's going on here is there's so many different dynamics going on within the site. You've got all these different fields, over 70 or 80 fields within the southern block, where lots of interesting dynamics and vegetations are happening. So trying to do those studies within this site, I think, is a fantastic opportunity, and I'm really hoping that Knepp becomes something equivalent to the White and Wood study that Oxford University has been doing there. And I think in terms of long-term opportunity, it's really exciting, and I feel like we're at the start of something big. So the 5 studies I'm going to be trying to cover. The first one is broadly covering vegetation structure, which has been touched on by Tom and Betsy. I've been doing a work on that, and more data has been coming in that they would have really benefited from, but I wasn't able to deliver in time. So I'm just going to update you on that a little bit. I'm going to talk about Georgina Pashler's work on spinescence, Claire Murphy's work on beetles, some of dung beetles as well. So I'm not going to get anything like the coverage that Sarah managed. Some on pollinators, and then just very, very quickly going to mention a study that we're doing as part of the Sussex Sustainability Research Programme, which is looking at the managing large herbivores for biodiversity, food security, and broader sustainability. Okay, so I better hurry up. Broadly, what we're interested in, I think, and why we're doing this study is kind of understanding these dynamics between disturbance and succession. I know Tony Whitbread talks about this a lot, and I think it's a really important message that we've got these really interesting dynamics in these low intervention studies where succession and top-down disturbance are interacting with each other to get some interesting dynamics. And then where the opportunity, where we've got lots of master's students here with lots of enthusiasm and skills themselves to come and look at a lot of other groups. And we've been looking at pollinators and beetles and mammals so far, but I think there's opportunity to look at ecosystem services. I think spiders, which is what my wife studies, is keen to get her into Knepp as well, and part of the team, and birds and all sorts. So I think there's a fantastic opportunity to really look at this dynamic in terms of vegetation structure, especially with the large herbivore community, and then what implications that has for these other groups. Certainly not limited to this. I'm sure there's lots of other things, and soil and microhyzae have been highlighted and their importance. So what have we been doing? We've been trying to understand some of the vegetation dynamics, and we've used 2 approaches to do this. One was to use a drone to do some structure from motion data collection. So we've been using this program called Drone Deploy. We've been sending up this drone, which has been doing all this hard work for us, where we basically can establish these flight paths where they're collecting lots and lots of photographs, which allows them to create vegetation structure models. So we managed to cover most of the southern block this spring/summer. We have flown over here, but we had some problem with the data collection. I'm hoping it's savable, but we have got a pretty decent coverage of most of the southern block, including all these fields and all these different dynamics going on within fields. And we've been able to convert this into a vegetation height map, essentially. So what you can see here is vegetation height. So this is what we did from the data we were able to get download from Drone Deploy. It gives you this height data, the structure from motion, which takes into account topography as well as vegetation structure. We'll be able to process the data to create a digital terrain model, then a digital surface model, and from that we can work out the actual vegetation height. So you can see all the hedgerows, trees, woodland areas, and then in the centre of the fields you can see these different dynamics and these different vegetation heights that are establishing between all the different fields. So this is some of the data that Tom and Betsy were referring to. We'll be able to take it a little bit further now. The reason we've got all these funny black lines is the way I've been analysing the data is to take a buffer to take the hedgerows out of contention and look at what's really going on in each field and see what kind of relationships we get. Like Tom and Betsy, kind of looking at to what degree does the year they were taken out of production determine some of the vegetation dynamics. And what we can see here is, as mentioned previously, we're not seeing a really clear relationship, clear successional relationship between vegetation height and year out, especially in these early 2000, 2002, 2003, where actually we're getting higher taller vegetation in 2003 than some of the places in 2002 and 2000, although the sample size for 2003 and 2005 are much higher. But what we do see is maybe that since 2003 there's a bit of a declining trend, so maybe as we go through years they haven't had quite as long to establish quite such tall vegetation in that time. Also looking at the standard deviation of vegetation height, so this is looking at the structural variation, the different habitats essentially are found within each field, and then looking at the variation between year, and you can see there's just a huge amount of variation between all these different fields. We're seeing lots of different dynamics going on, and lots of different outcomes from all those fields beyond just what year they were taken out of production. So one of the uses of these data is to try and look at habitat availability within each field. So this is just again a very quick analysis of looking at what percentage of the vegetation is below 1 metre, between 1 metre and 3 metres, and above 3 metres, which we were roughly looking at a field, scrub and tree layer. I mean, it's important to remember this drone data can't be massively brilliant in terms of resolution because it's just looking at the top of the vegetation. It's not penetrating through the vegetation, so it requires short vegetation, maybe some of the paths, in order to get that understanding of where the ground is. But again, we're seeing higher proportions of field cover, field layer cover in the more recently, I want to say abandoned fields, but abandoned isn't quite the right word. So yeah, some just general dynamics I just want to throw up there. I haven't done the analysis on them properly yet. Really keen to try and reassociate this data with what Tom's been doing in particular for the large herbivore populations. To try and get over some of the difficulties with drone data, we've also been using Lidar. So this is some new device. This is what's known as a geoslam, which is some funky technology that I guess we like to use. It's a handheld Lidar device, so it's firing out 42,000 laser beams per second, which basically creates point clouds, which allows you to get really detailed point cloud vegetation structures. You can basically create a detailed point cloud of what this vegetation actually looks like. So, for example, I think this was one of the new barn fields, new barn 4, I believe, that you can see from this, the points are coloured by vegetation height. So you get much better penetration, much higher resolution, so you can get some really fine-grained analysis of what these vegetation communities look like, which we can then turn into similar type maps and hopefully use this to ground truth some of the drone data or calibrate some of the drone data. So it's much smaller scale because obviously we have to walk around with it and has some other limitations. So in terms of the Masters projects as a whole, we have some overarching hypothesis for something to get started with, which is basically vegetation structural diversity will be positively correlated with species richness, basically trying to use that as a proxy for niche space, essentially. So it's quite a crude, broad-scale analysis, trying to get ourselves started, baseline data collection, but also trying to do some interesting studies to start with. We use standard deviation of vegetation height within 20-metre buffer around a centre point of each plots that were studied as a proxy for vegetation structural diversity or habitat diversity. And we used, the students in particular used a stratified random field selection design in order to try and get that vegetation structure between sites. But what they found, as I think Betsy showed earlier, we didn't necessarily get that so much. So we got more structural diversity in the fields taken out of production in 2002, 2003, but as it happened, not much going on in terms of structural diversity in 2004, 2005, and in permanent pasture, which doesn't necessarily actually relate exactly what we found at a field scale level. So something, just as it happened, we lack some structural variety within the data. And that's, again, just getting things started. We're hoping this baseline data is really going to improve our ability to establish experimental design into the future. So yeah, just skimming over this quickly, another way of showing what Betsy was doing. So they were, Betsy and the other students were doing, so between the 25th of May and the 15th of June, they collected most of their data. There's a 3-week field season. Each week they were taking 5 fields that were surveyed per week, and they were collecting data on small mammals, on pollinators and beetles, all from the same space. Yes, and yeah, I think we've covered most of that already. So the 3 projects I'm going to talk about, the first one is quite exotic, which I certainly like for it. So I was looking at the effect of megaherbivore gill intactness on the distribution of plant spinescence. If you've heard me talk before, I often talk about the fact that while the early Holocene is an interesting time to understand how vegetation dynamics work, the ecological history of southern Britain and the whole of Europe goes back a lot further, and species like the straight-tusked elephant was certainly a key species of the past in terms of driving vegetation dynamics. And many of the plant species that we have here today are adapted to the presence of those larger species. In comparison, southern Africa still has its intact megaherbivores, so maybe has some interesting dynamics going on that might be comparable. So essentially we're saying, what's the impact of the loss of straight-tusked elephant to be left with species like longhorn cattle and red deer? So the hypothesis with this, the hypothesis that Georgina was testing was looking at spines will be significantly longer and at higher density above 2.5 meters in the presence of megaherbivores. So it's essentially saying that once you get above 2.5 meters within Knepp, you'd expect browsing pressure to be basically removed because they just can't reach that high. They may get occasionally that high. They're quite adaptable, seem to make good use of their tongues and horns, but the browsing pressure is going to be severely reduced in comparison to the Zambezi, which has got giraffes and elephants, which are still very effective browsers. The other thing Georgina looked at was the relationship between spine density and vegetation height, suggesting that we're probably seeing plants invest less in spine density as you get higher and higher as the browsing pressure decreases. So their methodology involved, well, we decided we couldn't put them on step ladders from a health and safety perspective going around southern Africa up in thorn trees when a fast escape was occasionally required. So they used a broom to good effect where they hooked down their taller vegetation, and they were measuring the length and the density of spawns of thorns and spines on the acacia trees, and then blackthorn at Knepp in particular. And they were measuring on branches below 1 meter and above 2.5 meters. And they measured the density of thorns within a 30 centimeter section from the tip of the branch, whereas length was just from 10 centimeters. And then in the 9 fields, at Knepp, they were looking at this kind of height relationship. So they looked at every 30 centimeters what the density of thorns was doing over time. And what she found was that from a perspective of length, the length actually of these spines was quite similar, hadn't changed too much. So it didn't change too much between Knepp and the Zambezi. In both sites, they found that the length of spines was large the length of spine was higher, the higher in the vegetation they were at both sites. So it was actually Knepp having slightly higher spine length at taller vegetation. But interestingly, from a density perspective, plants are investing far greater resources into creating more spines per length of branch within the Zambezi, both at a low level and a high level. The browsing pressure is really intense, kind of consistently all the way through. And while it was quite long, while the spines were quite long, at high and breadth, they were very low density. So once you got over that 2.5 meters, they were investing very little effort into spine density on those branches, kind of suggesting they are capable of doing so, but they're not being triggered to do so. They may have an evolutionary adaptation to maintain spine density at a higher height, but won't get an ecological stimulus in order to invest into that resource, whereas lower down they were still investing quite a lot in terms of creating the number of spines they were creating, but still much lower than compared to the Zambezi. From a height perspective, you can also see this quite strong linear relationship. I wasn't sure if you would see some kind of step change where you would see browsing pressure kind of reduced at a particular height. But what you see as you go from 1 meter to 2.5 meters above of vegetation height, you get this quite strong linear decline in the mean density of spinescence. So, getting the suggestion they're just investing less and less in their protection as they increase in height, as browsing pressure reduces. We've already heard a lot about dung beetles. Claire also worked on dung beetles, also looked at carabid beetles, and was looking at the similar kind of question to Sarah, with two hypotheses that I was going to try and cover today. She was expecting the carabid beetle abundance and species richness would increase with increased vegetation structure, but thought dung beetle abundance and species richness might decrease with vegetation structure, maybe associated with larger herbivores maintaining their kind of activity in areas with lower vegetation diversity, with those kind of grazing areas based on some of Tom's work. Similar design, slightly smaller beetle traps than Sarah was using. I think you guys were chatting about some of that, and might be interesting to talk about the pros and cons of using the different surveying techniques. But a similar kind of idea of pitfall traps, 5 dung and 5 carabid traps set within each plot. So yes, a reasonably high survey effort put into that, and she also identified to species level. Similarly for the dung beetles, very similar results in the sense of this Onthrophagus similis, that I'm probably terrible at pronouncing, was by far the most abundant species found it's replicating those results. So 257 specimens. I was going to say, actually, that's an awful lot of specimens. I was worried about our kind of impact, but Sarah's totally blown us out of the water on that front. I don't know whether it made me feel better or worse about it all, but we probably ought to chat a little bit about kind of the impact of science. I was talking to Dave Goulson, who does a lot on invertebrates. He's obviously very famous for his bee work, and I think there's probably a lot of questions around, especially around Germany and all those kind of study sites highlighting that invertebrate numbers are really decreasing. And having mostly worked on big mammals, where we really can't just go around slaughtering everything as part of our study, I think this probably does need to be discussed. So I think we'll have it'd be a good chat to try and minimise our impact overall, while still getting this really important key data that were coming through. Also looking at carabid beetles, and again found this dominance of one particular species above others, and again found 10 species richness across both. In terms of their relationship with vegetation structure, I got lots of non-significant results to share with you. Essentially, species richness and species richness for dung beetles and carabid beetles showed no significant relationship, with lots of variation whether you had high vegetation structure or low vegetation structure. Same with the dung beetles. Particularly keen to start thinking beyond vegetation structure, which was kind of a good starting point and something of interest, but start relating that to some of the work that's been going on with small mammals and large herbivores as well. Similarly with the abundance, again, clearly no relationship going on with the carabid beetles, lots of variation within these fields. Some indication that it might have been a trend, but this is non-significant, and you can see here that there's some fields with lots of vegetation structure with very low abundance of dung beetles. So lots of interesting dynamics going on that I think require further research. Again, looking at the similar kind of style, this is Claire Wallace's work, looking at pollinator abundance and diversity. So again, looking at this kind of essentially the same question. You can see how I was trying to cope with 5 students working in, lots of students working on the similar kind of projects, to try and set up this also very interesting common patterns within different groups. She was looking at using pan traps, but also transects, where she was, these were good for identifying species, where she also used transects to identify groups of pollinators and their abundance and activity. And this is the kind of the range of species or groups she was finding, looking at bumblebees, butterflies, honeybees, hoverflies, moths, solitary bees, solitary wasp. Again, and lots of diversity over the year taken out of production, but again, in this case, pasture and taken out in 2005 suggested higher activity of pollinators. Again, lots of non-significant results in terms of vegetation structure, whether it's for bumblebees. I say butterflies, my son calls them catterflies, which I think is a far better name. Again, no significant relationships going on with these interactions. So other things going on, but lots of diversity, lots of interactions going on. And one of the things that Claire mentioned as potentially important is the bramble, where she tends to be suggesting that where there was lots of bramble, I think it was flowering at that time, there tend to be lots more pollinators active at that time. So maybe something more basic going on there. So I think some take-home messages. We saw this spine density significantly greater in the presence of mega herbivores, particularly above 2.5 meters, and then this quite clear decline in spine density as vegetation height increases. I think there's some interesting things to be said there in terms of the ecological interactions between herbivores and vegetation growth, and what implications that might have for the vegetation dynamics going forward. And then basically there's no significant correlations for the caribou beetles, dung beetles, bumblebee, butterfly, moth, hoverfly. And it's a shame that Betsy actually turned up today, because that was the one significant one I could have presented. But no, it's lovely to see you, Betsy. Just joking. And the last study that I wanted to cover quickly, and I'm probably going horribly over time, so I apologise, is this Sussex Sustainability Research Programme. So we were looking at the question is, how is managing large herbivores for biodiversity, food security, and broader sustainability? This is part of a wider sustainability research programme that's being undertaken at Sussex University at the moment. So we tried to do sustainability by starting at home rather than going abroad, which I think all other studies did. And we're really interested in this kind of these parallels between what's going on at conservation sites using large herbivores and what's going on in sustainably minded agriculture in terms of using large herbivores, and see what parallels and seeing why why different managers are using different management techniques. So we're looking at Ashdown Forest, Tablehurst Farm, which is a biodynamic farm, Knepp Estate and Butcherlands, and the comparisons between these two sites is really interesting. So Butcherlands is a Sussex Wildlife Trust site, not too far away, similar soil conditions and quite similar vegetation structures emerging there. We also looked at Saddlescombe Farm and Sheepcote, which is right on the edge of Brighton. So we looked at the vegetation structure in the same way we've been doing Knepp, and I've spoken to about earlier. But we're trying to get information across a lot of different aspects of what's going on. So we've been looking at bats, birds and soundscapes in general through sound recordings, put camera traps out to look at medium to large mammals and their activity, particularly in a similar way to Tom's been looking at the foraging intensity in those areas. We're going to do some soil analysis to try and cover the physical, chemical, biological, as well as pollinators, and using these very small pan traps, which are also quite effective at capturing a lot of different pollinators. So that's from the ecological side. So we're trying to take out some biodiversity metrics, but also understand the processes that are going on, the kind of dynamics, and try and relate these things to each other. But we've also been working with the social scientists, looking at the kind of the human aspect of why certain management decisions are being taken and what those managers think they will get out of it, to try and understand how different perspectives are leading to different management options, and then see if we can relate that to the ecological data to see if that's borne out at all. So this is called multi-criteria mapping, lots of interviews, really fascinating from a social science perspective, not an area that I seem to be doing more in without probably understanding enough. But unfortunately that's as far as I can go with this, because the results are currently flowing in, but I thought I would highlight it just in case it was relevant to other people's research in the future, because it's something I'm hoping that will be relevant and something we can expand upon. Next year we're going to have 9 master students doing projects. I very much hope to continue this work. We're going to have 2 looking at the large herbivore vegetation dynamics, and I think you would agree we'll probably need 2 students to replicate the amount of work Tom managed to get through in his time. We want to see the kind of interaction between pigs and birds, pigs and pollinators, pollinators on their own, 2 students looking at 2 students looking at small mammals, excuse me, and 2 looking at beetles again. I'm not sure they're too small. That really doesn't work. So hopefully, continuation of lots of interesting research, and this is clearly a sign that I've been talking too long. So I just want to say thank you for listening. Thanks to Knepp for allowing us and setting up such a brilliant project. Penny in particular for all the support she's been giving us, and then everyone I think that's been mentioned already, particularly the students working, and Rob, who's been integral for doing lots of work and keeping me out of trouble. Nick and Alan Stewart have also supervised students, and Rachel Durrant is the social scientist that's been doing lots of work as well, and funding from Sussex University and the Royal Society.